What would you do if someone called the police on you for simply existing? Marcus Green was just tending to his own property when flashing blue lights flooded the street. Within minutes, officers surrounded him, their hands hovering near their holsters. A smug, suited man stood nearby, arms crossed, smirking. "I caught him trespassing," James Carter declared, confident in his power. But then, one officer hesitated. His eyes flickered with recognition as he turned to Marcus and asked, "Sir, is this your property?" And in that moment, James's world began to unravel. What happened next changed everything. The morning sun bathed Maplewood Heights in a golden glow, illuminating the pristine mansions lined up behind wrought iron gates. It was a neighborhood where luxury wasn't just a lifestyle, it was a statement. Every driveway held sleek, foreign cars. Every lawn was manicured to perfection. James Carter sat on his marble patio, sipping his morning espresso, his eyes scanning the neighborhood like a self-appointed watchdog. He took pride in living among the elite, where people knew their place. That's when he saw him, a black man in worn-out jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, trimming hedges across the street. His old pickup truck, dented and covered in dust, sat parked by the curb. James squinted, his grip tightening around his cup. "Who let him in here?" he muttered under his breath. The man moved with effortless precision, snipping branches with skill. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he worked, seemingly oblivious to James's sharp gaze. James's face twisted in disgust. This was a private community, the kind of place where landscapers wore matching uniforms, worked in teams, and arrived in polished company vans, not in rusted trucks that looked like they belonged in a junkyard. He set his coffee down, jaw clenched. Something about this didn't sit right. The man, Marcus, as his shirt patch read, paused, stretching his back, and turned toward James. Their eyes met. Marcus gave a polite nod. "Morning, sir." James didn't respond. He turned his back, ignoring the greeting entirely. He was already reaching for his phone. This guy's trouble, I know it. He had lived in this neighborhood for nearly a decade, and never, not once, had he seen someone like that working alone here. His fingers hovered over the keypad as his mind raced with suspicions. Was he really a gardener? Or was he scouting houses, looking for an opportunity? James glanced back at Marcus, who had resumed his work, humming a tune as he carefully shaped the hedges. "If no one else is going to say something, I will." With a self-righteous huff, James tapped 911 into his phone and pressed call. "911, what's your emergency?" James didn't hesitate. "There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood," he said firmly, eyes still locked on Marcus. "I don't know what he's doing here, but he doesn't look like he belongs." He waited, convinced that he was doing the right thing. Across the street, Marcus wiped sweat from his brow and checked his watch, unaware of the call being made against him. James smirked as he heard the operator confirm that officers were on their way. "Let's see how this guy explains himself now." Sirens blare in the distance, approaching fast. The distant sound of sirens cut through the peaceful morning air, growing louder with each passing second. James Carter felt a rush of satisfaction as he watched two police cars pull up to the curb. Finally, someone who will take action. The patrol cars screeched to a stop, their blue and red lights flashing ominously. Two uniformed officers stepped out. Officer Graham, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and Officer Reynolds, younger, leaner, and scanning the scene with sharp eyes. James stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, wearing a smug expression. "There he is," James announced loudly, nodding toward Marcus. "That man's been hanging around here. I don't think he's supposed to be in this neighborhood." Marcus, who had been focused on trimming a hedge, turned around slowly, sweat glistening on his brow. His calm brown eyes flickered between the officers and James. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked, his voice even. James scoffed before the officers could respond. "Yes, this man is trespassing. I've never seen him here before, and he's acting suspiciously." Officer Graham's gaze lingered on Marcus for a beat longer than expected. He didn't immediately pull out his notepad or ask for ID. Instead, his brows furrowed, and there was something unreadable in his expression. Marcus, unbothered, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and sighed. "I'm just doing my job." Officer Reynolds glanced at his partner. "What's your name, sir?" Marcus Green, he replied, keeping his voice steady. James huffed. I don't care what his name is. He shouldn't be here. This is private property. Finally, Officer Graham turned to James. Sir, are you the homeowner? James blinked. Well, no, but I live here, and I know he doesn't. Marcus folded his arms, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. You sure about that? James faltered for a moment, caught off guard by Marcus's confidence. Officer Graham took a slow breath and turned back to Marcus. His stance softened ever so slightly. Mr. Green, he said carefully, do you own this property? James's smirk vanished. What kind of question was that? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket. James bristled, taking a step back. Hey, watch it. He's reaching for something. Officer Graham raised a hand to calm the situation. Sir, relax. Marcus slowly pulled out a key ring. With a deliberate pause, he inserted one of the keys into the garden gate's lock. With a click, the gate swung open effortlessly. James's mouth dropped open. Officer Graham and Officer Reynolds exchanged a knowing look, one that James completely missed. Officer Graham steps forward, eyes narrowing. Mr. Green, do you own this house? For a moment, there was silence. The key turning in the lock echoed louder than it should have. James Carter's face twisted in confusion as the gate to the grand mansion next to his house swung open effortlessly. Officer Graham's posture shifted instantly. His once firm stance softened, his sharp eyes widening with recognition. Sir? I mean, Mr. Green, Graham said, clearing his throat. This is your property? James blinked. Did he just call him Mr. Green? Marcus gave a small chuckle, stepping inside the gate. That's right, officer. He gestured toward the sprawling estate behind him. This is my home. James' face drained of color. Officer Reynolds glanced at his partner, then back at Marcus. His expression shifted from mild suspicion to embarrassment. We didn't realize, Reynolds muttered. James sputtered, his confidence crumbling. That can't be right. There's no way he... Marcus cut him off, pulling out his driver's license and a sleek black business card. Would you like to see some ID just to be thorough? His tone was cool, controlled, and dripping with irony. Officer Graham took the card, his eyes flickering to the embossed gold lettering. Marcus Green, founder and CEO, GreenTech Innovations. James's head snapped toward the card, reading the name as if it were written in another language. No way, James mumbled under his breath. GreenTech? Officer Reynolds repeated, his eyebrows shooting up. Wait, the GreenTech? As in the multi-million-dollar company that powers half the city's renewable energy? Yeah, that's the one, Marcus finished, crossing his arms. James stumbled back a step, his mind scrambling. The gardener he had been so eager to throw out of the neighborhood wasn't a gardener at all. Marcus was wealthy, powerful, respected, and James had just tried to have him arrested. A nervous chuckle escaped James's lips. I just assumed that I didn't belong, Marcus asked, his gaze sharp. James's mouth opened, but no words came out. Officer Graham exhaled sharply, looking frustrated. He turned to James with an unimpressed stare. Mr. Carter, I'm going to need you to clarify something, he said, his tone firmer now. Why exactly did you call us here today? James floundered, his throat dry. I thought... You thought he was trespassing, Graham interrupted, even though he had the keys to the property? James's ears burned. Officer Reynolds shook his head, tucking his notepad back into his pocket. You do realize that making a false report is an offense, right? Marcus simply watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed as James's world unraveled. James tries to salvage the situation, but Officer Graham pulls out his own notepad. Sir, we're going to have to talk about this false report. James felt his throat tighten, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides, his mind scrambling for an explanation. What? This must be a mistake, he stammered, forcing out a chuckle that fell flat in the thick tension of the moment. Marcus raised an eyebrow, pulling out his wallet with an effortless confidence that made James's stomach twist. He flipped open his ID and held it up. Marcus Green, founder and CEO of GreenTech. James's eyes locked onto the crisp business card, his vision blurring as he read the embossed letters. Green Tech. The name echoed in his head like a thunderclap. His heart pounded. Green Tech wasn't just some small business. It was a multi-million-dollar corporation, a powerhouse in the tech industry, a company far more successful than anything James had ever built. James swallowed hard. His mind flashed back to the luxury cars he'd seen passing through the neighborhood. One of them must have belonged to Marcus. The house he thought Marcus was trespassing in, he owned it. The officer's expression shifted from mild amusement to something colder. "Mr. Carter," Officer Graham said, voice laced with disappointment, "are you seriously telling me you let us out here to investigate the owner of this property?" James' mouth opened, then closed. He felt heat creep up his neck, his confidence draining fast. I I thought," Marcus let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, you thought." James's ears burned. This was turning into a nightmare. Officer Reynolds pulled out his notepad, flipping it open. "Mr. Carter, making a false police report is a serious matter." James's pulse spiked. "Wait, false? No, I really believed—" "You believed what?" Marcus asked coolly. "That a black man holding hedge clippers couldn't possibly live in your fancy neighborhood?" James's face turned beet red. Officer Graham exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This is not a good look." Mr. Carter James's body felt frozen in place. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. His neighbors were starting to gather, peeking from their porches, whispering. James saw his wife standing at their doorway, arms crossed, her face pale. His teenage son stood beside her, wide-eyed. Humiliation crawled over him like a disease. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. James yanked it out, desperate for a distraction. But when he saw the caller ID, his stomach dropped. It was his company's board of directors. He hesitated, his fingers trembling. James answers the call. His expression instantly darkens. "Wait, what do you mean there's a problem with my position?" James's breath hitched as Officer Graham's words hung in the air. "Sir, did you just make a false police report?" The weight of the accusation crashed down on him like a landslide. Around him, the murmurs of the gathered neighbors grew louder. His wife, standing on their porch, covered her mouth in shock. His teenage son shifted awkwardly, his face turning red from embarrassment. James stammered, his mind racing for an escape. "I thought he was trespassing. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Officer Reynolds gave him a long, unimpressed look. "Safe from what, exactly?" James' throat went dry. He could feel the heat of judgment burning into his skin. He turned towards Marcus, who still leaned casually against his luxury car, arms crossed, watching with an almost amused expression. "Look," James tried again, forcing a chuckle, hoping to ease the tension. "It was a misunderstanding. I just assumed—" "You assumed," Marcus interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "You saw a black man working outside and immediately called the cops. That's not a misunderstanding, Carter." James opened his mouth, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I've lived here for 2 years, yet somehow you never noticed? You never bothered to know your neighbors? Or did you just think someone like me couldn't afford to live next door to you?" The street fell into a tense silence. James's pulse pounded in his ears. I didn't mean it like that." Marcus let out a slow, deliberate sigh and shook his head. "Of course you didn't." Officer Graham flipped his notepad closed. "Mr. Carter, do you understand the severity of making a false report? We responded with 2 squad cars, lights and sirens, for nothing." James' stomach twisted. "I wasn't lying. I really thought—" Officer Reynolds crossed his arms. "Intent doesn't change the facts. You wasted our time and resources. That's an offense." James's face drained of color. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The police were supposed to be on his side. A neighbor, an older woman from across the street, scoffed loudly. "So quick to call the cops, James. But now that you're the one in trouble, you don't have much to say, huh?" James clenched his fists. This was spiraling out of control. His phone buzzed aggressively in his hand. He glanced down at the screen. Board of Directors. His stomach lurched. The realization hit like a truck. This wasn't just a public embarrassment. If word of this got out, it could damage his career. And Marcus Green. James swallowed hard. If Marcus was that Marcus Green, the one behind Green Tech, then James had just picked a fight with a man who could destroy him with a single phone call. The officers exchanged glances, their patience thinning. "Mr. Carter," Officer Graham said, "are we going to have a problem here?" James' entire body tensed as he realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move could send him plummeting. A heavy silence hung over the neighborhood. The police officers, neighbors, and even James's own family stood frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Marcus finally straightened, dusting off his sleeves as if this entire ordeal had been nothing more than an inconvenience. He exhaled slowly, then locked eyes with James. "You know, Carter," Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with something deeper. "This isn't the first time we've met." James's brows knitted together. "What?" Marcus took a slow step forward. 20 years ago, downtown corporate offices. You were the regional director of Carter and Wells Enterprises." James's breath hitched. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I was fresh out of college, a kid with big dreams, working as a junior analyst. I put in long hours, stayed late, worked weekends. I believed in that company. Thought maybe, just maybe, I could climb the ladder if I worked hard enough." James' stomach twisted into knots. His mind was racing, digging through decades-old memories, but nothing concrete surfaced. "Then one day," Marcus went on, "I walked into your office, full of ambition, full of hope. I presented an idea, a strategy to cut company losses and improve efficiency. It would have saved you millions." James swallowed hard, an uncomfortable feeling creeping over him. "But you didn't see potential when you looked at me, did you?" Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with the weight of history. "You saw someone who didn't belong." James took an instinctive step back. His throat was dry, his hands clammy. "You laughed me out of your office," Marcus said. "Told me I should be grateful just to have a job. Then 2 weeks later, you fired me without warning. No reason, no explanation. Just a box of my things and a security escort out the door." The crowd around them sucked in a collective breath. Even the police officers looked visibly uncomfortable now. James shook his head quickly. That was years ago. You expect me to remember every employee?" "Oh, you remember me now, don't you?" Marcus cut him off. "Because the black kid you threw away? He built Green Tech." James's face drained of color. His entire body locked up. Green Tech. The Green Tech that had revolutionized logistics and supply chain management. The Green Tech that now held million-dollar contracts with Fortune 500 companies. The Green Tech that had single-handedly outperformed Carter and Wells Enterprises. James felt his world tilting beneath him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Marcus let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then he leaned in slightly. "And you know the best part?" He smirked. "Remember that efficiency strategy I pitched to you? The one you laughed at?" James just stared at him, barely breathing. Marcus tapped his temple. That exact strategy became the foundation of Green Tech's success. A stunned murmur swept through the crowd. James's legs felt weak. As realization dawned, James's jaw went slack. His worst nightmare was standing before him. The man he once humiliated was now powerful enough to ruin him. A tense silence hung in the air as the officers exchanged disappointed glances. One of them shook his head and pulled out his notepad. "Sir," Officer Graham said sternly, "we're issuing you a citation for filing a false police report." James's face turned red. "False? But there was no crime committed here," the officer interrupted, his tone firm. "Calling the police on someone because of an assumption is not an emergency. Wasting police resources is a serious offense." James's hands balled into fists. He could feel the weight of the neighborhood's gaze, watching, whispering. From across the street, neighbors gathered on their porches, some with their arms crossed, others shaking their heads. A few even held up their phones, recording every humiliating second. And then he saw them. His wife standing at their doorstep, her arms wrapped around their 2 children. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The kids, still in their pajamas, peeked out from behind her, confused by the scene unfolding in their perfect suburban neighborhood. James's stomach twisted. His wife wasn't just embarrassed. She looked disgusted. Before he could process it, a smooth voice broke through the tension. "You never know who someone will become." Marcus. James turned sharply, facing the man he had wronged. Twice. Marcus stood there with an easy confidence, his hands in his pockets, looking at James like he was just another man who had underestimated the wrong person. James opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he even say? "You judged me before you knew anything about me," Marcus continued. "But here's the thing. You wouldn't have cared who I was, because to you, I was just a worker." He let out a dry chuckle. "I wonder, how many other people have you treated like this?" James clenched his jaw. He felt small, exposed. He had built his entire identity around power, around being respected. But today he wasn't feared. He wasn't admired. He was a joke. Then, suddenly, his phone buzzed. James grabbed it like a lifeline, desperate for a distraction. He glanced at the screen. Call from Richard Calloway, Chairman Carter and Wells. His blood ran cold. James's fingers hovered over the screen, a terrible realization hitting him. They knew. His entire company knew. And judging by the timing of this call, this was not going to be good. A cold sweat broke out on James's forehead. His pulse hammered in his ears as he tried to process what Marcus had just revealed. The man he had fired all those years ago, the man he had humiliated, was now one of the most powerful business magnates in the industry, and it was about to get worse. James's phone buzzed in his pocket. His shaking hands fumbled to pull it out. The name on the screen made his stomach lurch. Richard Calloway, chairman of the board. He swallowed hard before answering. Hello? James. Calloway's voice was firm, clipped. "Get to the office, now." James's throat went dry. I'm in the middle of... Now." The line went dead. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He turned to Marcus, who stood there with his arms crossed, watching him with an amused glint in his eyes. You spoke to them?" James rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shrugged. "Oh, I didn't have to." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Turns out, when one of the company's largest shareholders gets racially profiled and falsely reported to the police by the CEO, news travels fast. James's mouth went dry. "I bet by now the board is wondering," Marcus continued smoothly, "if maybe, just maybe, you're more of a liability than an asset." James's chest tightened. His mind raced, searching for a way out. If he lost his position at Carter and Wells, he would lose everything. The company, his reputation, his power. He gritted his teeth. "Listen, Marcus," he said, forcing his voice to steady. It was a mistake. I didn't recognize you. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. James. He leaned in slightly. "You recognized me just fine. You recognized what you thought I was. And that's the problem, isn't it?" James clenched his fists. His entire world was slipping through his fingers. Marcus took a step back and gave him a casual, almost sympathetic smile. "Well," he said, checking his watch, "I should get going. Busy day, you know." James's breath came in short gasps. His hands trembled. Then his phone buzzed again. He glanced down. Another call. From his CFO. His fingers felt numb as he answered. "James?" The CFO's voice came in a hurried whisper. "It's bad. The board is voting. You need to get here now." The call cut off. James's vision blurred. His entire career, his entire life was falling apart before his eyes. And the man responsible for it, Marcus, was already walking away, smiling. James sat at his desk, staring at the email on his screen. His hands trembled as he clicked it open. Effective immediately, James Carter is to step down from his role as CEO of Carter and Wells due to misconduct and reputational damage. A new executive will be appointed in the coming weeks. The board thanks Mr. Carter for his service. His entire body went cold. This couldn't be happening. Just days ago, he had been on top of the world, running a multi-million-dollar company, commanding respect, living in a gated community where people like Marcus didn't belong. And now, he was finished. The scandal had spread like wildfire. The videos of him falsely accusing Marcus had gone viral. Board members, investors, and clients all saw it. His name was dragged through the mud. Stockholders panicked. Investors pulled out. No one wanted to be associated with a CEO who made racist, impulsive decisions. James ran a shaky hand through his hair. Everything he had built, his career, his reputation, was gone. Then another notification popped up. An email from Marcus Green. Subject: Lesson learned. James's pulse pounded in his ears. Number: No, no, no. He clicked it open, his breath shallow. James, I used to think people like you had all the power. I used to think that no matter how hard I worked, people like me would never be seen as equals. But life has a way of balancing the scales, doesn't it? You fired me years ago. You looked down on me. And now, I own a controlling share in Carter and Wells. You always judge people based on status. But today, you've lost yours. And the person you dismissed as just a worker is now your superior. Lesson learned. Marcus Green. James clenched his fists, his face burning with humiliation. Marcus owned his company? This was worse than losing his job. It was losing to the very man he had once tried to erase. His head dropped into his hands. He had no power, no control. For the first time in his life, James Carter was just another man with nothing left. His phone rang, an unknown number. With a deep breath, he picked it up. A calm, confident voice spoke. James, it's Marcus. Let's talk. Marcus sat on the balcony of his mansion, overlooking the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. A warm breeze rustled the palm trees lining his estate, and in the distance he could see the very neighborhood where this story had begun. A neighborhood that had once judged him. A glass of aged whiskey sat untouched beside him, condensation forming along its rim. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. He was simply reflecting. He had built everything he had from the ground up. He had endured humiliation, discrimination, and being underestimated time and time again. He had been fired from a job he worked tirelessly at, a job that James had so easily taken from him years ago. But Marcus had never let anger consume him. Instead, he had taken that moment of humiliation and turned it into motivation. And now, James Carter was the one left in the dust. Disgraced, unemployed, forgotten. Word spread quickly through Maplewood Heights. James's wife and children had packed their bags and left, too ashamed to stay in a community that now looked at them with pity and scorn. The Carter estate was now on the market. James couldn't afford to keep it. Investors had pulled out, and with no job, his lavish lifestyle crumbled overnight. Marcus had heard whispers from former colleagues. James had tried to apply for new executive roles, but the moment anyone Googled his name, they saw the headlines. Ex-CEO accused of racial profiling in gated community. James Carter's downfall, how one call to the police cost him everything. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. A few days earlier, Marcus had taken James's call, not because he owed him anything, but because he wanted to see if the man had changed. Marcus, James's voice had been shaky, uncertain. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Marcus had let the silence stretch for a moment. Didn't you? He had finally asked. James had stammered, scrambling for excuses. It wasn't personal. I thought, you were just a gardener, and… Marcus had chuckled, cutting him off. That's the problem, James. You never stopped to think about who someone really was. You judge based on status, wealth, skin color, and now you're on the receiving end of it. James had gone quiet. Then after a long pause, he had muttered, I lost everything. Marcus had sighed, leaning back in his chair. No, James, he had said. You threw everything away. You let your arrogance, your prejudice, and your sense of entitlement blind you. You did this to yourself. Silence. Then James had whispered, what am I supposed to do now? For the first time, there had been no ego in his voice, no pride, just a broken man looking for answers. Marcus had taken a deep breath. That's not for me to decide. And with that, he had ended the call. Now as he sat on his balcony, Marcus felt a strange sense of closure. James had been humbled. Maplewood Heights, once an exclusive, snobbish gated community, had changed after the incident. Neighbors who had once turned up their noses at Marcus now greeted him with nods of respect. Nobody looked at black workers the same way anymore, because now they knew. The man trimming your hedges today might own half the city tomorrow. Marcus picked up his glass, taking a slow sip. Never judge a person by their job. One day they might be signing your paycheck.